The first shard of morning light sliced across the canyon rim, striking the newly installed window. It was a compass rose, intricate and vibrant, crafted from a dozen shades of colored glass, Elizabeth's design, lifted from the final pages of her journal. Derek Briggs ran a calloused thumb over the leaden seam, his breath fogging the cool pain. Each piece of glass was a memory: the sapphire blue for her eyes, the amber for the color of her hair in the afternoon sun, the deep crimson for the stubborn passion that had defined her. He had spent a month on this window alone, a silent, painstaking tribute that would serve as the school's heart. From this entrance, all direction, all knowledge would flow outward. The crunch of hooves on gravel below broke his reverie. It was a sound he knew too well, the deliberate, arrogant gait of Sterling Rhodes's black stallion. And he wasn't alone. Two other riders, broad-shouldered men who served as Rhodes's physical extensions, flanked him. Derek stepped out from the timber-framed entrance he had carved from the living rock. He didn't reach for the rifle propped against the wall. That was not the game Rhodes played. The banker's weapons were contracts and whispers, fear and obligation. Rhodes reined in his horse, his polished boots a stark contrast to the canyon's raw ochre dust. He surveyed the entrance, his gaze lingering on the compass rose window. A thin, appreciative smile touched his lips, but it never reached his eyes. They remained cold chips of slate in a pale, unyielding face. "Briggs," he said, his voice as smooth and cool as riverstone. A remarkable piece of craftsmanship. "Your wife had a talent for such things, didn't she? A decorative mind." The condescension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. "She had a talent for many things," Rhodes Derek replied, his voice a low gravel. He kept his hands loose at his sides. Indeed, Rhodes mused, dismounting with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. He ran a gloved finger along the wooden frame of the entrance. "And this project, it is a testament to her memory. A grand, heartfelt, and monumentally foolish gesture." He turned his full attention to Derek, the smile gone, now replaced by an unnerving stillness. Some memories, Briggs, are better left buried, along with the dead. One of the banker's men, a thick-necked brute named Cutter, dismounted and took a step forward. His hand rested on the stock of his rifle. "This is my land," Derek said, the words flat and hard. "What I build on it is my business." "Your land," Rhodes chuckled, a dry rustling sound. "Nothing in this territory is truly anyone's own. It is all interconnected. Your decisions affect your neighbors. Your ambitions can cast a shadow over us all. This folly." He gestured to the school entrance. "This is a very long shadow." Clara appeared in the entrance behind Derek, her face pale. She was 19, but carried the quiet gravity of someone who had learned life's harder lessons too young. Elizabeth had been more than a teacher to her. She had been a mentor, a beacon. Rhodes's eyes flickered to her, a flicker of something that might have been annoyance, or perhaps something darker. "And here is the prize pupil. Tell me, child, has Mr. Briggs been filling your head with your late teacher's dangerous notions of progress?" Before Clara could answer, Rhodes gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Cutter. The big man lifted his rifle. It was not a threat aimed at Derek, but at the window, at Elizabeth's memory. "No," Derek breathed, taking a step forward. The rifle butt slammed into the center of the compass rose. The sound was not a crash, but a sickening crystalline pop that echoed off the canyon walls. A spiderweb of cracks erupted through the sapphire and amber and crimson glass. Then, with a sound like sighing chimes, the entire window imploded, showering the stone floor with 1,000 glittering tears. Derek froze, his hands clenched into fists, a hot roar filling his ears. He saw Elizabeth's face in the shattered fragments, heard her laughter dissolving into the terrible silence. Rhodes watched him, his expression one of clinical observation. A tragic accident, he said, his voice laced with mock sympathy. He mounted his stallion, the leather of his saddle creaking in the quiet. Be careful with your investments, Briggs. They can be so fragile. He turned his horse, without a backward glance, rode away, his enforcers trailing him like shadows. Derek was left standing in the wreckage, the morning sun now pouring through a jagged, empty hole. The message was clear. This was not about land or money. This was an eradication. Sterling Rhodes had not come to stop the building of a school. He had come to desecrate a memory. And he had just begun. The town of Cedar Ridge lay gasping under a sun that baked the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder. It was a town of quiet desperation, of faded paint on storefronts, and the permanent worry etched into the faces of its people. Hope was a commodity scarcer than water. Sterling Rhodes, from the cool, dark interior of his bank, controlled both. His ledgers were a web of debts and dependencies that held the town in a state of suspended animation, too indebted to grow, too frightened to fail. Derek's project was an act of defiance against this creeping paralysis. It was a promise he'd made to Elizabeth in the last fever-hazed days of her life. Her voice, thinned by illness, but still burning with conviction, had mapped out her vision. "Don't let them be content with ignorance, Derek," she had whispered, her fingers tracing the designs in her journal. "Ignorance is a cage they don't even know they're in. Give them a key." The school was that key. He spent his days in the canyon, his grief channeled into the rhythmic bite of the saw and the solid thud of the hammer. The labor was his solace, a way to keep his hands busy while his heart ached. In the evenings, he returned to his small ranch house, the silence a constant reminder of his loss. He would sit at the kitchen table, Elizabeth's journal open before him, her neat, decisive handwriting a ghostly presence in the lamplight. He studied her lists of books, Gibbon and Shakespeare, Newton and Euclid, and her sketches of a classroom designed for open inquiry, not rote memorization. He was not just building a structure. He was resurrecting a philosophy. His allies were few, but their loyalty was forged in the fire of shared respect for Elizabeth. Clara, whose mind Elizabeth had sharpened like a fine blade, was his most dedicated helper. She organized the book orders, her correspondence with Eastern suppliers crisp and professional. She saw the school not as a memorial, but as a continuation. Tobias Crow. The town blacksmith supplied the custom ironwork brackets and hinges forged with an artist's care. "A structure's strength is in its connections," he'd grunted, handing Derek a set of perfectly balanced window latches. His own loan from Rhodes was a heavy chain around his neck, but his belief in Elizabeth's work gave him the courage to pull against it. Allison Quaid, who ran the general store, quietly extended Derek credit he could not afford, marking his purchases down in a separate ledger she kept hidden under the counter. "Elizabeth taught my boy to read," she'd said simply when Derek tried to protest. "Some debts can't be paid in coin." But for every ally, there were a dozen townsfolk paralyzed by fear. They saw Derek's wagon loaded with expensive lumber and glass and saw only recklessness. They heard the faint sounds of construction echoing from the canyon and heard only the invitation of trouble. Rhodes fed this fear, cultivating it with casual remarks and pointed questions. He was a master of insinuation, planting seeds of doubt that grew like weeds in the arid soil of their anxiety. Few knew the source of Rhodes's particular venom. It was a story buried by time and the town's collective reluctance to speak of its deepest sorrows. The fever that had taken Elizabeth 2 years ago had not been selective. It had swept through Cedar Ridge like a phantom fire, and among its victims had been Thomas Sterling Rhodes's only son, a quiet, frail boy of 8. Sometimes in the twilight hours, Rhodes would ride out to a windswept hill overlooking the valley. There, beneath a lone, twisted juniper, was a small unmarked mound of stones. He would stand there for a long time, a solitary figure etched against the dying light, his back ramrod straight, his grief a fortress no one could penetrate. In town, his bitterness would occasionally surface in cryptic remarks. "There is a high price for progress," he'd said once to Mayor Knox, "and it is often paid by our children." Another time, hearing a farmer praise Elizabeth's teaching, he'd muttered, "There are some lessons best left unlearned. The lessons of educated fools who play God." The whispers followed him, but no one dared connect the threads. The loss of a child was a private, sacred wound. To speak of it was to trespass. But Derek was beginning to sense that the school Elizabeth's legacy was a constant, agonizing pressure on that wound. The day after the window was destroyed, Rhodes made his move. He didn't send his enforcers. He didn't wait for Derek to come to him. He confronted him in the middle of the main street as Derek was loading supplies onto his wagon outside Allison's store. Rhodes emerged from his bank dressed in his customary black suit, a figure of stark urban authority amidst the dusty frontier chaos. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Mr. Briggs," he called out, his voice carrying in the still afternoon air. Several townsfolk stopped what they were doing, sensing a public execution was at hand. Derek turned slowly. He had spent the morning carefully removing the shattered glass, his hands now crisscrossed with fine cuts. "I have been reviewing your accounts," Rhodes announced loud enough for all to hear. "A matter of fiscal prudence, you understand. Given the current economic climate and your significant recent expenditures on non-essential construction materials." He tapped the papers. "Your ranch loan, the one your father took out and you inherited, is up for its semi-annual review." Derek said nothing. He watched the faces of his neighbors, saw the mixture of pity and fear. They were all caught in Rhodes's web. Under normal circumstances, a simple extension would be a formality. Rhodes continued his tone, that of a reasonable man, forced to make a difficult decision. "However, your current financial activities represent an unacceptable level of risk to the bank. You are overextended, Mr. Briggs. Your assets are being diverted to a project with no discernible return on investment." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a more personal, more venomous level. "Therefore, as president of the Cedar Ridge Bank and Trust, I am exercising my right under Clause 7B of your agreement. I am calling your loan due. You have 30 days to remit payment in full." The pronouncement fell like a guillotine. The full value of the ranch. An impossible sum. It was not a business decision. It was a death sentence. Allison Quaid appeared in the doorway of her store, a stricken look on her face. Tobias, shooing a horse across the street, let a hammer fall to the dust with a dull thud. 30 days, Rhodes. Derek's voice was dangerously quiet. "You know that's impossible." 30 days, Rhodes repeated, his eyes glinting with cold triumph. He turned to the assembled onlookers. "This is what happens when men prioritize sentimental dreams over practical reality. Let this be a lesson to all of us." He turned and walked back into the cool darkness of his bank, leaving Derek standing in the oppressive heat, the weight of an entire legacy suddenly resting on his shoulders. The conflict was no longer hidden in the canyon. It was here in the open, a public battle for his home, his future, and the last promise he had made to his wife. That evening, Rhodes called a town meeting. He didn't need the mayor's authority. His financial hold was authority enough. The church hall, usually reserved for Sunday sermons and potluck socials, was filled with a tense, anxious silence. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene from the lamps and the heavier scent of fear. Rhodes stood behind the pulpit, not as a man of God, but as an arbiter of a more immediate and tangible salvation, financial stability. Derek entered with Clara at his side, Elizabeth's journal, a solid weight in his coat pocket. He felt the eyes of the community on him, a mixture of accusation and morbid curiosity. These were people he had known for years, men he had helped brand cattle with, women who had shared recipes with Elizabeth. Tonight they looked at him as if he were a stranger, a carrier of some foreign contagion. "Friends, neighbors," Rhodes began, his voice resonating with a practiced, solemn gravity. "We are at a crossroads. A decision has been forced upon us that will shape the future of our home for generations to come." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Mr. Briggs, a man we all respect, a man suffering from a grief we all share, has undertaken a project that, for all its noble intentions, threatens the very fabric of our community. He was a master puppeteer pulling the strings of their deepest anxieties. He is building a school. Not a simple schoolhouse like the one his dear wife managed so capably, but an institution, an academy, the kind of place that attracts attention. Murmurs rippled through the pews. Attention was the last thing they wanted. Attention brought territorial officials, tax assessors, and federal marshals who enforced laws made by men 1,000 miles away, who knew nothing of their lives. An educated populace. Rhodes continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is a populace that asks questions. They begin to quibble over land surveys. They challenge established water rights. They attract lawyers and bureaucrats who will tell us how to live, how to work, how to raise our children. Is that the freedom we came to this territory to find? The freedom to be governed by outsiders? Mayor Knox, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, shifted uncomfortably in the front pew. "Sterling, perhaps we should let Derek speak for himself." "Of course," Rhodes said with a magnanimous wave. "Let him explain why his private tribute to his wife is more important than the peace and autonomy of this entire town." All eyes turned to Derek. He stood, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He was not a man of words like Rhodes. His hands, not his tongue, were his most eloquent tools. "Elizabeth believed our children deserved the same chances as any child back east." Derek said, his voice rough but clear. "She believed knowledge was a tool, not a threat. A tool to build a better life. The school, it's for them, for our future." "And what of our present?" Rhodes countered smoothly. "What of Tobias Crow's smithy, which depends on contracts from ranchers who value simplicity? What of Allison Quade's store, which thrives because our needs are straightforward? This progress you speak of will disrupt everything. It will create new hierarchies, new conflicts. It will turn a simple community of neighbors into a complex society of competitors." It was a brilliant, insidious argument, framing education not as an opportunity, but as a poison that would corrupt their simple Eden. Then a clear voice cut through the tension. "That's not true." Clara stood, her hands clasped before her, her knuckles white. She was just a girl, but her eyes held the fire of her late teacher. "Mrs. Briggs taught me that education doesn't disrupt, it protects. She taught me to read a contract, to understand numbers. It's because of her lessons that I was able to help my father see that the interest rate on his seed loan from Mr. Rhodes' bank was calculated incorrectly, in Mr. Rhodes' favor." A stunned silence fell over the hall. The accusation was audacious, a direct strike at the heart of Rhodes' power. Rhodes's face for a fleeting moment lost its composure. A mask of cold fury settled over his features before he smoothed it away. "The girl is confused," he said dismissively. "A perfect example of what I mean. A little bit of knowledge misapplied becomes a dangerous thing. She sees malice in a simple clerical error." Was it a clerical error when you did the same to my family? A farmer called from the back. And mine, another voice added. The carefully constructed unity Rhodes had built began to fracture. But fear was a powerful glue. This is precisely the chaos I warned of. Rhodes thundered, seizing the moment. Accusation, suspicion. This is the poison that Elizabeth's ideas spread. Do you want more of this, or do you want a return to the simple trust that has always been the bedrock of Cedar Ridge? The crowd was torn. The seed of doubt about Rhodes had been planted, but the fear of change, of the unknown future the school represented, was deeply rooted. They looked from Rhodes's commanding presence at the pulpit to Derek's solitary figure, and in that moment of hesitation, Derek knew he had lost them. The town meeting had not been a debate. It had been a verdict. He was an outsider now, a threat to their fragile peace, and he was utterly alone. In the days that followed, Derek became a ghost in his own town. Neighbors who had known him for 20 years now averted their eyes, crossing the street to avoid him. Allison Quaid still gave him supplies, but her face was tight with worry, her movements furtive. Tobias Crow continued to work on the iron fittings, but he did it after dark, smuggling them to the canyon like a conspirator. The town, under Rhodes's subtle and constant pressure, had closed ranks against him. Derek retreated to the canyon, his isolation fueling a grim determination. He worked from dawn until his muscles screamed in protest, then worked more by the light of lanterns. He and Clara, now his sole, unwavering partner, pushed the project forward with frantic energy. They began the painstaking work of installing the bookshelves along the smooth, cavernous walls. "They're just scared," Clara said one afternoon, her voice echoing in the vast space as she catalogued a crate of books on geology and botany. "Mr. Rhodes is an expert in fear. Fear is a hard thing to fight." Clara, Derek replied, hoisting a heavy oak plank into place. It's easier to believe a comfortable lie than a difficult truth. He suspected Rhodes's opposition was more than just a desire for control. The man's obsession felt too personal, too heated. He'd heard the bitter way Rhodes had mentioned the fever, the same fever that had taken Elizabeth. A dark, unwelcome thought began to form in Derek's mind, a connection he didn't want to explore, but could no longer ignore. He tasked Clara with a new line of inquiry. "Go through the old town records at the mayor's office," he told her. "Look at the death certificates from 2 years ago. The summer of the fever." While Clara investigated the past, Rhodes escalated his attacks on the present. A wagon carrying a shipment of custom-milled desks from a town 50 miles away arrived with a broken axle, its contents splintered and ruined at the bottom of a ravine. The driver, a man Derek knew to be reliable, claimed a freak accident, but his eyes wouldn't meet Derek's. A few days later, 2 of Derek's prize cattle were found dead, near a watering hole, their bodies bloated. The local veterinarian called it a stomach sickness, but Derek knew it was poison. These were not accidents. They were messages delivered with the cold precision of a predator isolating its prey. One evening, Derek noticed a flicker of light from the hill that overlooked the valley, the same hill where rumors said an unmarked grave lay. He climbed a nearby ridge, his spyglass in hand. Through the lens, he saw him Sterling Rhodes standing beside the small cairn of stones, his silhouette stark against the bruised twilight sky. He wasn't praying. He wasn't mourning in any conventional sense. He was simply standing there, a sentinel keeping watch over a long-dead sorrow. The sight solidified Derek's suspicion. This wasn't about the town. It wasn't about interest rates. It was about that small patch of earth and the ghost that haunted it. The next day, Clara returned from her research, her face grim. "I found it, Derek," she said, her voice low. She spread out copies of the town records on a workbench. 13 people died in that outbreak. Elizabeth was the last one. She pointed to another name on the list at the date of death just 3 weeks before Elizabeth's. Thomas Rhodes, age 8, cause of death high fever respiratory failure. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of unbearable grief, twisted into a dark and terrible shape. The final piece of the puzzle came from a reluctant Dr. Alistair Finch, the town's aging physician. Derek found him in his small office, a place that smelled of antiseptic and regret. At first, the doctor refused to speak of it. That was a terrible time, Derek. Best to let it lie. I can't let it lie. Derek insisted, his voice gentle but firm. Rhodes is trying to destroy everything Elizabeth stood for. I need to understand why. The doctor's shoulders slumped. He looked out the window, his eyes focused on a past only he could see. Rhodes's boy, Thomas. He was fading fast. We were trying everything I knew. Cool cloths, quinine. But the fever wouldn't break. He paused, his voice cracking. Then a traveling healer came through town, selling a folk remedy. A poultice made of nightshade and river mud. Rhodes was desperate. He bought it. He believed it was a miracle cure. Dr. Finch looked at Derek, his eyes swimming with guilt. Elizabeth got wind of it. She came to my office, a botany text in her hand. She showed me the chapter on nightshade. Belladonna, a poison. She argued. God, she was fierce. She said applying it would be a death sentence, that it could be absorbed through the skin. She called it unscientific superstition. And you listened to her? Derek said, his stomach clenching. Yes, the doctor whispered. I was the physician. I forbade Rhodes from using it. I told him it was dangerous quackery. We continued with my treatments, but the boy, he was too weak. He died 2 days later. The doctor finally met Derek's gaze. Sterling Rhodes never forgave me. But it was your wife he truly blamed. He saw her education, her science, her dangerous new ideas, as the thing that had stolen his son's last chance at life. He believes to this day that Elizabeth murdered his child. The revelation struck Derek with the force of a physical blow. This entire war, the shattered window, the public humiliation, the poisoned cattle, was not a battle for the town's future. It was a ghost story. It was a father's inconsolable rage, a vendetta against the memory of a woman he blamed for the emptiness in his life. The school was not just a symbol of progress to Rhodes. It was a monument to the woman who had, in his twisted view, killed his son. And he would not rest until he had ground it and its builder into dust. Armed with the terrible truth, Derek rode into town the next morning. He didn't go to the bank. He went to Rhodes's house, an imposing 2-story structure at the end of the main street, a monument to wealth and isolation. He found the banker in his study, a room lined with leather-bound books he never read, and maps of territories he sought to control. "We need to talk," Derek said from the doorway. Rhodes looked up from his desk, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, before the customary mask of cold civility slid into place. "Briggs, to what do I owe this intrusion? Have you come to beg for an extension on your loan?" "I know about Thomas," Derek said, the name dropping into the quiet room like a stone. For the first time, Derek saw Sterling Rhodes stripped of all pretense. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. His face became a canvas of raw, undiluted anguish, his eyes burning with a grief so profound it was terrifying. "You will not speak his name," Rhodes hissed, rising from his chair. "You have no right." "She was trying to save him, Rhodes," Derek said, his voice pleading. "Elizabeth was trying to save your son's life. The remedy was poison." "Lies," Rhodes roared, his voice breaking. "The lies of an educated woman who thought she knew better than a father's instinct, and she and her books, her science." She stood in my way, filled the doctor's head with her arrogance, and my boy paid the price. He stalked around the desk, his body trembling with a rage that had been festering for 2 years. She took my future from me, Briggs. My legacy. My son. His voice dropped to a chilling, venomous whisper. So I will take hers. I will erase every trace of her from this valley. I will tear down this monument you are building to her memory. Stone by stone, I will salt the earth where it stood. People will forget her name. They will forget her dangerous ideas. There will be nothing left of her. Nothing. The confession was absolute, a declaration of total war. Rhodes's hatred was a living thing, a force of nature that would not be reasoned with. You're a fool, Derek said softly, a deep sadness settling over him. Blinded by a grief you won't let go of. Rhodes laughed, a horrifying broken sound. And you, Briggs, are a dead man walking. He moved to his window and pointed out at the street. Look, no one will sell you another nail. No one will transport another book. The freighters have been warned. The suppliers in the next county have been informed that your credit is worthless. Your allies in town, I hold the deeds to their businesses. One word from me and Tobias is hammering tin cups in a prison workshop, and Allison is selling thread from a cart. It's over. You are finished. Your wife's dream dies with you. Derek looked out the window and saw the truth in it. He was completely and utterly cut off. The last plank of lumber, the last box of chalk, and the last pane of glass had been delivered. He was stranded on an island of his own, making with no resources, no support, and 30 days until he lost the very ground beneath his feet. The vendetta was no longer a secret. It was a public strangulation, and Sterling Rhodes was slowly, methodically tightening his grip. That night, the sky broke open. A storm born in the distant peaks rolled into the valley with the fury of a vengeful god. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that turned the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge into churning rivers of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, like the splitting of the world, and lightning bleached the landscape in stark, instantaneous flashes of white. It was a night unfit for man or beast. It was the perfect night for Sterling Rhodes. He believed Derek was broken, isolated, and defeated. He believed the town was cowering in their homes. Now was the time to deliver the final, irrevocable blow. Under the cover of the storm's chaos, he and his 2 enforcers, Cutter and Miles, rode out from town. Their saddlebags were heavy not with coin, but with canvas-wrapped sticks of dynamite and coils of fuse. Inside the school, a single lantern cast a warm, golden glow. Clara, caught by the storm's sudden violence on her way back to town, had decided to take shelter there. She was sitting at one of the new desks, running a cloth over its smooth surface, finding comfort in the quiet solidity of Elizabeth's dream. The storm outside was a distant roar, the school a sanctuary of peace carved from the heart of the mountain. Derek, from his ranch house, saw the 3 riders through a momentary blinding flash of lightning. He saw their grim, determined shapes moving against the storm, heading not for the open range, but toward the canyon. He saw the distinctive bulk of the saddlebags. In an instant, he knew. Rhodes wasn't just going to let the school die of neglect. He was going to murder it. He didn't stop for a coat or a hat. He grabbed his rifle, stuffed a handful of cartridges into his pocket, and burst out into the raging storm. The wind tore at him, and the rain felt like thrown gravel against his skin. He ran his boots sinking into the grasping mud, his heart pounding with a terror that was colder than the rain. Clara. He had seen her heading toward the canyon earlier. She was in there. By the time he reached the canyon entrance, they were already at work. Miles was holding the horses, while Rhodes and Cutter worked by the bobbing light of a hooded lantern. Cutter was drilling a hole into the timber frame of the main entrance, while Rhodes was carefully unwrapping the dynamite. Here Rhodes shouted over the wind, handing a stick to Cutter. "This will bring the whole thing down. Bury it. Bury her." Derek raised his rifle, the rain streaming down the barrel. "Rhodes." They spun around, their faces stark and pale in the lantern light. Rhodes' expression was not one of surprise, but of grim satisfaction. "Briggs, I was hoping you'd come. It's fitting you should witness the end." Cutter abandoned the drill and drew his pistol. "Get out of here, rancher." Derek fired not at the man, but at the rock just above his head. The rifle's crack was sharp and loud, even against the thunder. Chips of stone rained down on Cutter, who yelped and scrambled back. "Fool," Rhodes snarled. He pulled his own revolver. "You can't stop this." Derek scrambled for cover behind a cluster of boulders as a pistol shot whined past his ear. It was a desperate, impossible fight. Two armed men, a raging storm, and a ticking clock he couldn't see. He saw Cutter run back to the entrance, a length of fuse in his hand. Inside, Clara heard the gunshot. She ran to the entrance, her heart seizing with fear. She saw the men outside, the glint of steel in the lantern light, and understood. She wasn't trapped. She was the objective. As Rhodes and Miles laid down covering fire, pinning Derek behind the rocks, Cutter jammed the dynamite into the hole he'd drilled, stuck the fuse in, and lit the end. The fuse sparked to life, a tiny, sizzling serpent of fire eating its way toward detonation. "Done," Cutter yelled. "Let's go." Derek saw the sputtering fuse. He had seconds. He broke cover, running straight toward the entrance, a wild, desperate gamble. He had to get to that fuse. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt, another kicking up mud at his feet. He tackled Cutter just as the big man was turning to flee. They went down in the mud, wrestling for Cutter's pistol. The storm was a symphony of chaos around them, the roar of the wind, the crash of thunder, the frantic shouts of men. Suddenly, a new figure appeared at the mouth of the canyon, stumbling through the mud, a lantern held high. It was Dr. Finch. His face was a mask of sheer terror and old, inescapable guilt. "Sterling!" The doctor screamed, his voice a raw, ragged shriek that cut through the storm. "Stop, you have to listen." Rhodes, distracted for a critical second, turned toward the doctor. It was the opening Derek needed. He slammed Cutter's head against the rocky ground, grabbed the man's pistol, and fired at the lantern Miles was holding. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. Plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the strobing flashes of lightning, the fight became a primal, brutal struggle. Derek scrambled toward the entrance, his eyes fixed on the tiny, sputtering point of light from the fuse. It was almost at the wall. He reached it, his fingers grasping for the thin, burning cord. It was slick with rain, hot to the touch. He pulled, but it was wedged tight. At that moment, Rhodes loomed over him, his face contorted with hate. "It ends now, Briggs," he roared, raising his pistol to fire at point-blank range. The remedy was poison, Sterling. Dr. Finch shrieked again, his voice cracking with years of suppressed truth. It was Nightshade Belladonna. It would have killed him. Elizabeth was right. She was trying to save him. The words screamed into the heart of the storm, hit Sterling Rhodes harder than any bullet. He froze, his pistol aimed at Derek, his finger on the trigger. His entire world, the carefully constructed edifice of righteous hatred that had defined his life for 2 years, crumbled to dust in that single terrible moment. The fuse sputtered its last inch. Derek gave one final desperate yank. It came free in his hand, just as the lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in a brilliant, silent tableau. Derek on his knees, holding the extinguished fuse. Clara, a horrified witness in the school's entrance. Dr. Finch, a prophet of doom, weeping in the rain. And Sterling Rhodes, a man utterly, completely broken his gun, falling from a nerveless hand to splash into the mud below. The thunder rolled away into the distance, and for the first time, the only sound was the steady drumming of the rain. As the storm broke, so too did Sterling Rhodes. The fury that had animated him was gone, replaced by a vast, horrifying emptiness. He sank to his knees in the mud, the doctor's words echoing in the sudden quiet of the canyon. Poison. She was right. She was trying to save him. The truth was a weight far heavier than his grief had ever been. His years of hatred, his crusade against Elizabeth's memory, it had all been built on a lie. He hadn't been honoring his son. He had been desecrating the memory of a woman who had tried to protect him. Cutter and Miles, seeing their employer collapse and the fight go out of him, surrendered without another shot. When Mayor Knox and a small posse of townsfolk, alerted by a panicked Dr. Finch, arrived at dawn, they found a scene of surreal stillness. The entrance to the school was scarred, but standing. Derek, bruised and mud-caked, stood guard. And Sterling Rhodes sat staring into nothingness, a man hollowed out by a truth he could no longer escape. The clear light of the morning revealed the full extent of his violent obsession. The sticks of dynamite, the drilling tools, the raw, naked hatred that had brought them there, it was all laid bare for the community to see. The whispers and fears Rhodes had so carefully cultivated evaporated in the face of this ugly reality. They saw the damaged school not as Derek's folly, but as something precious, something that had been threatened and must now be protected. Tobias Crow was the first to act. He walked over to the damaged entrance frame, running a hand over the splintered wood. "This can be fixed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Derek and then at the assembled neighbors. "This will be fixed." Allison Quaid stepped forward, laying a hand on Clara's shoulder. "The books," she said. "We need to make sure the books are dry. We'll organize a party to clean up." One by one, the people of Cedar Ridge, the very people who had shunned Derek, rallied around him. They saw in the school not a threat, but a promise. And they saw in Derek not a troublemaker, but a man who had been willing to sacrifice everything for a dream that would benefit them all. Their fear had been overcome not by arguments, but by the undeniable proof of where that fear, when manipulated by a broken man, could lead. They organized work crews, bringing lumber from their own homesteads and offering their time and labor. The act of rebuilding the school's entrance began to rebuild the fractured trust of the community itself. Rhodes was taken into custody, but there was no trial. Stripped of his power and his purpose, he was a ghost. He signed over the bank to a territorial consortium, his signature a weak, shaky scrawl. A few weeks later, he was gone. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He simply rode out of the territory, a solitary figure heading east, leaving behind the small, unmarked grave on the hill and the wreckage of a life spent hating the wrong person. Months passed. The Canyon School thrived. The town council, with Mayor Knox at its head, established a community trust to fund its operations, ensuring it would never again be dependent on the whims of a single man. The wound in the entrance was repaired, and in place of Elizabeth's shattered compass, Rose Tobias Crow forged a simple, elegant iron sunburst, a symbol of a new day. The grand opening was a town-wide celebration. The school was filled with the sounds of life and laughter. And the most surprising, most gratifying sight for Derek was seeing the children of his staunchest former opponents sitting at the front of the class, their faces alight with curiosity, as Clara read to them from one of Elizabeth's favorite books. The future Elizabeth had dreamed of had arrived. That afternoon, after the last of the families had gone home, Derek stood alone in the quiet of the main classroom. The setting sun, streaming through the new sunburst, cast long, warm shadows across the floor. He walked to the teacher's desk at the front of the room. From his coat he took out Elizabeth's worn journal, its pages filled with her plans, her hopes, her unwavering belief in the power of knowledge. He ran his hand over the faded cover one last time, a silent communion with the woman who had started it all. He placed the journal gently on the corner of the desk. Then for the first time, he turned away from it. His promise fulfilled, his heart finally at peace. He looked out through the open entrance, past the canyon walls, toward the wide, open horizon, ready to face the future he had built.